Planet Money helps you understand the economy. We find the people at the center of the story.
Garbage in New York, that was like a controlled substance.
We show you how money influences everything.
Tell me what you like by telling me how you spend your money.
And we dig until we get answers.
I had a bad feeling you were going to bring that up.
Planet Money finds out. All you have to do is listen. The Planet Money podcast from NPR.
On November 8th, 2020, Chelsea Congan's life changed forever. She was preparing for a backyard party when the Pitkin County Sheriff's Office arrived at her home in Old Snowmass.
The policemen came and found us there and let us know that our son Miles had died in Boulder and his body had been discovered that morning.
Thinking back on that moment, she says it felt unreal.
It feels as if your entire life just shatters on the floor. And for some reason, you're still standing.
Her son, Miles Brundage, was a 19-year-old sophomore at the University of Colorado. He'd grown up racing down the slopes in Aspen on skis and playing the piano.
He plays it much faster than the composer ever meant him to.
His mom said he was a master prankster, and his nickname was Smiles.
Miles was a very social person. He was funny, he was quick, and his friends just loved him. He was very entertaining.
He was also starting to chart his own path as a young adult.
He was figuring out how to have a life of his own and live in an apartment and do all of those things that you figure out.
Days before his death, Miles had dislocated his shoulder. The hospital in Boulder reset it and sent him home with 4 Percocet. When he ran out, he turned to the social media app Snapchat to buy more. According to investigators, 2 of those pills were laced with enough fentanyl to kill 3 people. After Miles' death, Congan hacked into her son's account.
I took screenshots of all of the interactions Miles had had for the 2 days leading up to his death, and I shared those with everybody Miles knew.
But when the Boulder Sheriff's Office reached out to Snapchat for more information about the account holder, the company never responded, and the investigation went cold. The case is still unsolved.
It's an insult. It's pain on top of everything else. If that person who has a Snapchat account is still out there, and if this is still their business, they're still selling things that contain fentanyl on a social media platform that every single kid uses. And I can't get Miles back. I can't spend another crazy day with Miles. But I would like that not to happen to somebody else's kid. And I would like that person, whether they knowingly or unknowingly sold Miles fentanyl, to be stopped from doing it. Because that's the only thing I have left that I can do.
Congan was one of several parents who worked on a bill to require large social media sites like Snapchat, Facebook, and Instagram to cooperate with law enforcement and to take steps to enforce their own policies on illegal activities and remove accounts that break the rules.
It was a significant policy change, and it seemed poised for success. The bill passed the legislature with broad support in both chambers, but then it got to the governor's desk.
Governor Jared Polis vetoed the bill. He said he understood the motivation behind it, but was worried about free speech and privacy.
This happens every session. Lawmakers get behind a policy, and the governor stops it in its tracks.
But this time, it looked like things might turn out differently. Backers of the bill tried to override Polis's veto, something that almost never happens.
If we fail to act, if we let this veto stand, we are choosing to protect the business interests of billion-dollar tech companies over the safety of Colorado kids. That's a choice I refuse to make. I urge a yes vote to override this veto and send a clear message. When it comes to our children, Colorado does not compromise.
The override passed the Senate, but ultimately failed in the House. And as the session winds down, it made for a dramatic late showdown.
The close call serves as a warning sign for Polis, in his last year and a half as governor, that the legislature, particularly its Democratic majority, may be increasingly willing to challenge him.
This is Purplish from CPR News and the Colorado Capital News Alliance, a show about Colorado politics and policy. I'm Benta Birkeland, and joining me is Jesse Paul from the Colorado Sun.
Hey, Benta. Today we get to talk about one of the spiciest issues under the Gold Dome, this controversial social media bill, and the way it brought to light some long-standing, sharp divisions between lawmakers and the governor.
When Governor Polis vetoed the social media bill, he set up the potential for a rare veto override discussion. I checked into this, and the last successful veto override was in 2011.
And while Polis got his way this time, and he got to save a bit of face in the process, there's still much to talk about.
Yes, a lot to talk about here in terms of all the politics behind it. But let's talk about the social media bill at the center of all of this, what it would have done, why backers feel so strongly about it, and why Polis and a lot of other opponents outside the Capitol came down so hard on the other side.
The situation also gives us a window into a broader legislative dynamic, the governor's power to overrule the work of lawmakers, and what it takes for them to fight back through a veto override. This bill, Senate Bill 86, is something that advocates have tried to get through at the legislature for a few years now. Like we said at the top, their goal is to crack down on illegal activity happening on large social media sites. Things like the selling of guns and drugs, as well as sex trafficking and sexual exploitation of minors. It's really aimed at protecting kids.
Backers say they just want to see these large social media companies enforce their own policies, because all these things are against the rules for Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram. I talked to the main Democratic sponsor about it, Senator Lindsay Doherty. She said she was really moved by what a lot of these families have been through.
As I dug into this policy and I realized how much these companies are profiting off of children, they do have responsibilities here because children are dying because of the people they are letting use their sites, while they are profiting billions with a B off of these children. And families have been completely ruined and devastated.
Benta, you really dug into this bill. Can you walk us through what it would have actually done?
It was pretty wide-ranging, and I'll hit some of the big highlights here. First, it would have required companies to be responsive when law enforcement is investigating a crime involving their platforms. So that means having a staffed hotline for Colorado law enforcement to call, and the companies would have to respond to warrants within 72 hours. Before we go on, I will just say this part of the bill was not a sticking point for opponents. They were largely okay with this, including the governor.
Okay, interesting. So we talked at the top about this instance of Snapchat not getting back to investigators as they were looking into the fentanyl-related death. From following this bill, did you get a sense of how common that is that social media sites don't work with investigators?
What I heard from law enforcement at the hearings and prosecutors is that it's pretty inconsistent in terms of when and how social media companies respond. A lot of law enforcement supporting the bill, the chiefs of police, the district attorneys. Brian Mason is the district attorney in Adams and Broomfield counties, and he said he's particularly concerned about how these social media companies may be helping make juvenile crime more deadly.
A juvenile cannot legally go into a gun store and buy a gun. So where do they go? They go to the marketplace on social media.
That means when police want to know where guns involved in a crime came from, they often need the help of social media companies to track that down. And Mason said the response in these investigations is really hit or miss.
It often goes unaddressed. We hear nothing for days and days and days at a time. And in order to solve a crime like a homicide, time is of the essence.
So as you said, this particular idea that social media companies would have to respond and work with law enforcement investigators within 72 hours was not a real sticking point on the bill.
It wasn't. California passed a similar law last year, that law enforcement piece. It's actually everything else in the bill that brought out the opposition. And the list of who's opposed is pretty broad. You had the governor and a lot of other groups from the tech industry. You also had gun rights groups and the ACLU and other progressive groups that work with marginalized communities.
When you looked at the governor's veto letter, he seemed to agree that the bill has good intentions. Like, he likes what the thing was trying to do, but he just didn't like how it was trying to go about that. He said that it would erode privacy, there would be impacts to freedom and innovation, and that it would potentially subject Coloradans to scrutiny of constitutionally protected speech. Those are some pretty damning words.
One of the big concerns for the governor is the bill would have set up a government-mandated process for how social media companies had to deal with possible lawbreakers on their sites, accounts violating their policies.
Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, so let's say you or I go on Facebook and we see something we think is illegal, like there's an account advertising drugs. We flag it to Facebook. Under the bill, they would have 48 hours to check and see if this complaint is frivolous. If it's not frivolous, they would have up to 10 days to investigate. And if the company concludes, yes, this account was indeed violating our policies, they're trying to sell and advertise drugs or illegal guns or sexually exploiting a minor, that account would have to be removed within 24 hours. I heard from all sides it was the key point of contention.
Polis described it as imposing the government's chosen penalty of permanently, quote-unquote, deplatforming a user, that's just fancy for removing somebody, from a private company, even if the underlying complaint was malicious and unwarranted. Basically, he just worried that it was too broad and would sweep up too many people.
Exactly. He and other opponents, they thought it gave social media companies too much authority to make these kind of decisions. One Democrat told me she doesn't trust Facebook to do anything. But for their part, supporters say, look, this is narrowly tailored. These things are already banned on the sites. It's simply requiring companies to follow their own internal policies. I would add that social media platforms already do remove accounts. It's just not something that people think they do enough of.
But for people like Polis, he just feels like it's really not the government's place to be telling private companies who can and can't be on their platforms. Remember, Jared Polis knows the internet. He's on Reddit, he's on Twitter, he talks to us all the time on those. And that's where he made his fortune. So he has a lot of big feelings about these things.
And that's where we really see this proposal butt up against free speech concerns. The ACLU opposed the bill. Conservative groups did too.
Yeah, those are some weird bedfellows. And I think you really saw that play out in terms of who voted for and against the bill at the State House. The lawmakers who did vote against it were some of the most conservative folks, and some of the most progressive members didn't like it either.
Yeah, you don't usually see those two sides align on things, especially a significant policy like this. But there was this overlap when it came to free speech, privacy. For conservatives, too, they were worried about parents' rights, so that was a whole nother layer to this.
There was even a conversation about gun rights and gun access that got roped into this. And that's all because it required companies to keep an eye on their users, right?
Yes, specifically, companies would have to issue an annual report, and that would gather data on how many minors are using these platforms, how often they're using it, how long, and then how much they interact with content that violates the company's policies. The industry really pushed back on that idea.
SB 86 therefore mandates platforms create a publicly available roadmap for targeting kids. It is impossible to see how disclosing such information helps more than it harms the effort to protect children from predation.
That was Patrick Hedger testifying before the Senate Judiciary Committee. He's the director of policy at NetChoice. Members of this group include kind of a who's who of the tech world. We've got Google, Meta, Snapchat. The list is just so many companies you've heard of. Another concern was also from the governor's office here. Michael McReynolds testified. He's the legislative liaison for the Office of Information Technology. And he said asking companies to monitor younger users and compile these reports would actually violate another Colorado law, one that protects people from too much tracking online.
If they're being told specifically to withhold certain information or classify it in a certain way and hold it and store it, aggregate it, sort it, that is going against the actual principle of the Colorado Privacy Act, which is really focused around data minimization. Again, it's any data that you don't have to keep. The Colorado Privacy Act essentially says you should not be storing that data.
On the other hand, companies are already collecting all of this data, and advocates for the bill say they should be more transparent about it. It would allow states to craft better policies to make these platforms safer.
That testimony from McReynolds is pretty interesting to me because while the governor typically makes his feelings about a bill known, he usually doesn't send people to the legislature to speak out this forcefully against something.
Yes, that's exactly what one of the lawmakers on the committee said. It's just we don't see the governor's office come out in the first committee hearing opposed to a bill. A lot of times they're in an amend position, so they want changes, but it's not straight out opposition. And I feel like McReynolds kind of drew the short straw for this one. I mean, people testified 2 to 3 minutes, and then there was time for questions. He sat there for about 45 minutes getting grilled by lawmakers in both parties. They clearly knew they had a problem with the governor's opposition on this, and they really took their time trying to draw out those objections.
Yeah, but even though lawmakers knew about all the objections that the governor's office had, the bill didn't get saved. Lawmakers didn't change it to meet him halfway, and we know that Polis didn't give an inch either.
On that note, it seems like a good time to switch gears from the policies in this bill to the politics around it. This is Purplish from CPR News and the Colorado Capital News Alliance. One of the fun things about covering the legislature, you think you've seen everything about how lawmakers do their work, and then they do something new, or if not new, something really, really rare. And that certainly happened for me in this case for this bill.
Yeah, Benta, you have been around the block, not to date you or anything, but have you ever seen the legislature try to override a veto before?
The last ones were 2011 and 2007. I was there in 2011. It didn't feel as consequential. It dealt with budget spending requests, so not a big policy like this social media bill that's gathered a lot of attention and has a lot of people caring passionately on various sides. And I have to say, back in 2011, I don't even remember it all that much, but I can hardly remember what stories I worked on a couple days ago, so a little caveat there.
So usually lawmakers just live with a veto. They're not happy about it, but they work on the policy in the off season and try to come back with something that they can get past the governor. But this time, the backers of the social media bill thought they had the supermajority they needed to get this through, and they were pretty fired up about this policy.
I guess for all the drama around the idea of the legislature overruling the governor, we talked about this veto override clearing the Senate. I was surprised how quickly the Senate did that. I was going to block off my whole morning for it, but there was no debate, just brief remarks from the Democratic and Republican sponsors. And the vote came out with the same count as the original bill, 29-6.
In some ways, that lack of debate actually made sense to me. The Senate had already debated the bill, it passed the chamber by a wide margin, so there wasn't really a need for senators to put the governor on verbal blast when their actions were about to speak louder than their words.
So it clears the Senate pretty quickly. It's Friday morning, but for an override, it still needs to go through both chambers. So this started in the Senate because it was originally a Senate bill. Then it goes over to the House. A very different story in the House.
Very, 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 very different. That's where things fell apart for the supporters of this measure. People really just jumped ship. It originally passed through the House by a 46-18 margin, and it needed at least 44 yes votes to get the override through. But in the end, the House didn't even take the vote on the override. The backers of the bill came up, conceded defeat, and asked that the House essentially table the effort.
We have accepted the fact that the governor has exercised his authority to veto this bill, that the Senate has exercised their constitutional authority to override that veto, and that today the votes are not here in this chamber to do the same. That is a statement of fact. I also accept the reality that some legislation has a timeline far longer than 120 days, and that there's more work to do here.
I've talked to some of the supporters of the bill, the mom we mentioned, her son Miles, who passed away. They're, I think, pretty heartbroken to be so close to seeing this maybe become law, and then it all fell apart. And I've heard a lot of people finger pointing about how this went wrong, when it went wrong. One of the people I talked to was Dawn Reinfeld, and she's with Blue Rising. That group worked with parents and other supporters, and she said she's really disappointed in Democrats in the House for delaying the vote, because as we mentioned, there was a weekend between the two votes. It came to the House on Friday, and then there was intense lobbying over the weekend, particularly from Rocky Mountain gun owners. That's a very conservative pro-Second Amendment group, and flipped some Republicans who weren't then as comfortable with it. Despite all of the different people involved with this, though, Reinfeld told me she ultimately places the blame on Governor Polis.
The Democratic governor of Colorado partnered with the social media platforms and far-right extremists to kill a bill meant to protect children from sex trafficking or illegal gun sales or fentanyl. That's what happened today in Colorado. The governor joined forces with the far right.
His office disputes that. They say it misses the forest for the trees. They note that a lot of different groups across the political spectrum opposed this bill all along and thought it just left too many Coloradans at risk of losing their social media accounts.
So for the bill backers, their frustration was that the House didn't move quickly enough on the veto override. I guess they could have taken it up on the same day as the Senate on Friday, right?
Yes, and backers say, hey, if it had happened Friday, they think it would have passed. I talked to the Democratic House sponsor about this, though, Andrew Baesnecker, and he wasn't sure he had the votes Friday. As we said, he could only lose 2 votes for the override to succeed. And for a lot of Democrats, it's pretty risky to put a vote forward when you don't know if you have the votes.
Members rightly had questions about the implications of this vote, and that's something that I take seriously. Not that I'm not advocating very strongly for a policy that I believe in and that isn't needed in our state. But, to your original question, it's more than a vote on the underlying policy at that point, and I think rightly so. At least on our side of the aisle, members had questions.
I don't know. I feel like it was kind of the ultimate punt not to take the vote. They didn't even vote on the override, which protected people who may have wanted to switch from a yes on the policy to a no on the override. Like, my takeaway was that the representatives didn't have the stomach for it.
It's interesting because, as you said, I've been around the block and covered the legislature for a while. And when Baesnecker said, we weren't totally sure, we could only lose 2 votes, it brings me back to times when our state house had margins like a 1-vote margin in chambers. So every single vote on a controversial bill was like, they didn't necessarily know what was going to happen. I think Democrats who are in the majority now are so used to having these wide margins where it's like, I can lose this many votes and that many votes and it'll still pass. That was not the case for the veto override. And of course, they needed Republicans too.
I guess just to boil this all down, I would just say that the representatives simply weren't willing to gamble with the governor's support on this. They've all got bills they want passed, that they want the governor to sign into law, and to kind of stick a thumb in his eye is a little politically dangerous. So ultimately, there were some 30 representatives who voted for the bill in the House, who then ended up supported laying over the veto override question till after the session, which killed the bill.
But that was at the sponsor's request to table it over. So we still don't know how many of those 30 voters actually would have backed an override had they voted on it.
That's true. But I think this is a good segue to a bigger picture conversation here, and that is the governor's leadership style, and why a veto override or even a discussion about it is so rare in Colorado.
First, let's remember Polis served in Congress for a decade. He takes a hands-on approach to the legislative process and crafting legislation. He's very interested in the policy.
Hands-on, stranglehold, tomato. His office works closely with lawmakers to shape bills and policies, even before something's introduced. So, a lot of times, he's the parent offering advice you don't want.
Yeah, or you do want. If you agree with him, there's no better partner to have. If you don't agree with him, people are like, they're meddling too much. There's always been that push and pull with the legislature and with various governors, too, on certain policies. So it's not like Polis is totally unique here, that a governor's going to weigh in on policies. But, Jesse, I'm curious what you think. Polis only has one more legislative session. He's term limited. Do you think we'd be even having this discussion about veto overrides if it had been earlier in his administration, let's say his second year in office? Or does it show a growing frustration or maybe more tension among Democrats that they're going to push back?
Look, the big picture here, what you got to know is that Democratic leaders actually do have power to make sure that a veto override discussion doesn't even happen during the session. They ultimately decide when bills come up for debate on the floor and when final votes are taken, and they also decide when to sign a bill and send it to the governor.
Explain for people what significance this has. I mean, just people know we have a 120-day session. After that, lawmakers are gone.
Yeah, it's a little complicated in the rules, but as we've mentioned, the governor wears his policy emotions on his sleeve. I think we've kind of beaten that horse. So lawmakers know when he's going to veto something. Often leadership in the legislature will kind of throw the governor a bone and wait to send him a bill that he's going to veto until after the session is ended. That way, no override vote can be taken, the governor saves face, and lawmakers don't have to kind of stick their thumb in the governor's eye.
Yeah, that explains why we don't see a lot of vetoes during the session. We see a lot of bills signings, but those vetoes are going to happen after session. And there's a lot of strategies lawmakers use to try to avoid a veto. It's not something lawmakers want to have happen. People are sponsoring a bill because they want it to become law.
One strategy lawmakers deploy to avoid a veto is to simply kill their own bill. We actually saw that happen a couple times this session. There was that bill that would have required that climate warnings accompany gasoline sales. There was also a bill that would have required that porn sites verify their users' age. Both of those died because folks knew that the governor was going to veto them if it made it to his desk.
And then other times lawmakers work with the governor's office to try to get the governor on board, try to find compromise.
Yeah, the major gun bill this year is actually a really good example of that. It started off as a broad ban. It ended as a permitting process that still bans the manufacture of certain semi-automatic guns, but it allows the purchasing of them after you get vetted, take a class, and pass a test. That change was specifically made to appease the governor.
We've talked about Democrats in the majority having control over the legislative calendar. So a veto override discussion really does come down to how much legislative leadership wants to push back against the governor or even have the discussion at all, given that they still have a lot of bills they want to get through in the final days of session.
Right. All of this is really a political choice.
Jesse, this brings me to a question you asked during a recent media availability. We were with Democratic leaders in the Senate, and you asked if a veto override would be a black mark on the governor, or if they have concern that it's an embarrassment for the governor.
Yeah, and they said they didn't really have a concern. They were pretty firm on that. This is Senate President Pro Tem Daphne Michaelson-Janae.
I don't know that it would be a black mark on the governor. He has a right to veto a bill. We have a right to override that veto. It's all part of the process.
I think Michaelson-Janae is being a little bit gratuitous here. I mean, look, a veto override is pretty embarrassing for the governor. You and I both know how much he did not want this social media veto to be overridden.
I'm thinking back to last year when the governor vetoed 3 union bills. Democratic lawmakers, including one of the House leaders, rallied outside his office at the Capitol. They were with union leaders. They were chanting.
Yeah, I remember that. I think they were saying something like, F you, Polis. I don't know. Am I allowed to say that? Is this radio? I don't know. Anyways, he's been pretty active with his veto pen. 10 is the most bills that the governor has vetoed from a session.
And that's more than former Governor John Hickenlooper. I looked, and his highest number in 2 terms was 9. I talked to Speaker Julie McCluskey about this. She's the House Democratic leader. I asked, is there a strategy behind having a veto override discussion?
I think it's very important that the General Assembly maintain its separate power, and we have the ability to call for a veto override and should exercise that if we believe that our membership has come together in a bipartisan way, both Democrats and Republicans. We can't do it if it isn't bipartisan, right? It has to be both parties. I think that function is incredibly important.
Jesse, you had talked about this timeline of when the governor gets a bill. The reason this matters is because if he vetoes a bill and lawmakers aren't in session, they can't override the veto. The only way they can is if there is a special session. The governor calls a special session, but also lawmakers can call themselves back into session with a 2/3 vote. I don't see any circumstance that lawmakers would vote to come back to the Capitol in the summer or something to override a veto.
Dude, you just 100% jinxed us.
That's it for this episode. Purplish is a production of member-supported Colorado Public Radio and the Colorado Capital News Alliance.
The CCNA is a collaboration between KUNC News, Colorado Public Radio, Rocky Mountain PBS, and the Colorado Sun, with support from news outlets throughout the state. Funding for the Alliance is provided in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. I'm Jesse Paul.
And I'm Benta Birkeland. Our producer is Stephanie Wolf, and our editor is Megan Verlee. Sound design and engineering by Shane Rumsey. Our theme music is by Brad Turner.
Purplish will be back in your feeds next week. Subscribe now so you don't miss an episode.
This is Purplish from CPR News and the Colorado Capital News Alliance.